Welcome! In this video I'm going to show you how to make a sword striking animation in Godot. So as you can see over here we have the player controlled character and we have an enemy over here that I can actually collide with, but the sword strike is going to be a different type of collision. And I'll just show you if I hit the spacebar, this sword comes out, and if the sword hits the enemy, then the enemy disappears. But you could have any sort of other animation there, death animation you'd like for your enemy. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm not going to be going over the platforming code or anything of that, just over the sword here. So this is the code that we start with here. And in fact, if I run this, you'll see everything is the same, except if I press space, there's no sword. So, and I should just quickly say the assets I'm using are from a pack on itch.io, and I will post the link in the description. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a sword for the player. And so I'm going to come up here to the player, which is a kinematic body, and I'm going to add a node, and I'm actually going to make my sword an area 2D. And even if your sword is part of your animation, you would probably do the same thing. You'd make an area 2D, and you'd probably call this hitbox, the player's hitbox, and the enemy will then have a hurtbox. But because it's actually, mine is going to contain the sprite as well, I'm going to call it sword. But remember, it is the hitbox of the enemy. So we have the area 2D there. And we're going to attach a few things. The first thing is a sprite. And the sprite I have down here, the sword. So we'll bring that up to the top here. Now, if I zoom in here, you'll see we have a few problems. First of all, it's very big. So I'm just very quickly going to go down to the transform, and maybe we'll do a sort of 2/3 scale. I think I can just go 2 divided by 3. Oh, it's integer, okay. 0.66. And then I'm probably going to want to rotate the sword around, so I'll do it 90 degrees, so it's facing this way. And then I think we'll probably place it about here. Let me just go back to the sword itself, and I'm going to move the sword itself. You can see this little icon here. I'm going to move the sword up to the same level that I wanted there. And then that's going to form the pivot, because when the player flips around, what I want it to do is the sword is going to rotate around 180 degrees around this pivot and face the other way there. So we have a sword, we have the sprite, and I'm going to click on the sword itself, and I want the sword to appear behind the parent. And I'm pretty sure there's a visit down here in visibility, show behind parent. I'll click on there, and now it's behind the parent. Make sure you do the sword there, not the sprite, because you want the sprite to appear behind the player. So you have to have the whole sword appearing behind the player. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our hitbox. So I'm going to, well, the whole thing is a hitbox, but this will be the collision shape 2D. So I'll say we want a collision shape 2D, and I'm just going to do a square and keep it simple, or a rectangle and keep it simple. It's a bit hard to see this on that background, but I will do the best that I can. Now, it's a good idea to make your collision area a tiny bit bigger than the sword, because there's nothing worse than the player feeling like they're being cheated out of a hit that they actually got. So I'm just going to make that a tiny bit bigger. And so that's the collision shape then on the sword here. And if I hit F5, you'll see we are running around with the sword. But then if I turn the other way, it's not coming with me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my player code here, and in the player code, I think I have a bit here where I flip the sword here. So what I might just do is I will say, hold on, let me check what I had on my other one. I will copy this in. So we're just going to rotate the sword around. And now hopefully, yes, it is facing in the right direction. Okay, here is the problem though. The problem is that let's tackle this one step at a time. The first thing is let's make the player be able to be hit by the sword. So if we go to, the enemy to be able to hit by the sword. So if we go to the enemy here, we're going to add to the enemy an area 2D, which is going to be the hurtbox. And I'm not going to use the actual area of the actual collision shape of the enemy, because I want to be able to place the hurtbox a little bit differently and deal with it differently. So I'm going to actually make another area here. So we'll say area 2D. And when you're doing yours, I really suggest you have this hitbox hurtbox system. It works really, really well. So I'm going to call this hurtbox. And the hurtbox we will add a collision shape 2D to. We'll come over here and we will add a shape. I'm again going to keep very simple, and I'm going to make a rectangular shape. Now again, it's a little bit hard to see here, but hopefully you can see that I'm actually making it a little bit bigger than the collision shape for the enemy. Again, I want the player to feel like that it's fair, and it's better to swing the odds in the player's favor a little bit. So if the sword even touches the outside of this little bit, then it will get the enemy. I think that might be a little bit too, too large. So we'll bring it in there. Now the next thing is I only want the sword to interact with the hurt box. I don't want those two things to interact with anything else. So for those things, I'm going to actually use the collision system, and I'll show you how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the player's sword here, click on the sword, and go to collision. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and place the sword's collision area on layer 5. And I've just chosen 5 as one that I'm not using. And you can go and rename these if you want to, but I'm just keeping it simple. Layer 5. And then I'm going to go to the enemy's hurt box here and go to the collisions. And I'm not going to place that on layer 5. I'm going to say it's looking for layer 5. So on the mask here. Now you can actually do that the other way around and it will still work perfectly. You can have, basically it looks for a connection between the two, and if they're both on layer 5, one on here, one on the other, it will make a connection between the two of them. So now they will only deal with those things. So if this collision area touches anything else in the game, it's not going to trigger any of the events or the signals or any of those things, which is really, really good. Now, how do we make the enemy actually get hit by this? So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to the hurt box over here, and I'm going to go to the nodes and say on area entered. So the area that's entering is this collision shape on the sword, because that's the only thing it will collide with. So on area entered. And we are going to then connect that to the enemy and go connect. And what do we want to happen when the hurt box area is entered? Well, I'm just going to keep it simple and say queue free. So that's going to destroy the enemy at the end of the frame. Now let me just see if that works. I hope it works. It might not. Yes, and it does. Okay, so that's working so far. However, that is not a strike animation yet. I want to hit the spacebar and have this sword come out and strike the player over here. And so for that, I am going to make an animation player. And if I go to the sword here and add a new node, and I'm going to add an animation player. And the animation player, oops, I am going to add a new animation, and I'm going to call it hit. So we have one. I don't know how long it's going to be at the moment, but we can change the settings a little bit in a minute. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we're going to start off with the sword. If I click on the sword up here and come across to visibility, the sword is actually going to be invisible at the start of the game. And then when this animation runs, it's suddenly going to become visible. And so I'm going to key that down here so that becomes visible. And then I'm going to say after a short period of time, oops, so we'll say maybe 0.3 and 0.3, so 0.3 of a second, or maybe, yeah, we'll try 0.3 of a second. I'm then going to say it becomes invisible, and then that should become, if I play the animation now, becomes visible and then becomes invisible. And then if I make the whole thing 0.4 seconds, there's just that little bit of time at the end that if I press the spacebar again, it's not going to actually start a new animation. So it just gives it a little bit of cooldown time at the end there. So there's the animation. And the only other problem though is that the player's running around with an invisible sword, but the collision shape is still active. So what we want to do is click on the collision shape here, and we will go to the disabled block here, and it's actually going to be disabled by default. But then in the animation here, we're going to turn off disabled just for this little moment here. And then when the sword hides, we're going to turn on disabled again. And so most of the time, it's actually going to be disabled. And I'm going to click disabled now. So we've created the animation. How do we actually run this animation? Well, what I'm going to go into is I'm going to go into the sword here, and I'm actually going to create a script for the sword. So here's a script that I had before, and so I've just saved a bit of typing here. So what I'm going to say is if the input is action just pressed UI accept, or you can do any other key that you like, animation player.hit. And if I run that now, then I should have a situation where I can run around here and nothing happens, but if I hit it, then it disappears. So I know that was a little bit complicated and it is a fair bit of work, but once you get this set up, it really can completely transform your game and make it a lot more interesting. One final thing that I might do just to show you the power of the animation player is just show you that you can change absolutely anything else in this. So for example, the sword position here, the transform, you could actually make the sword like move out a little bit as you go. And I didn't practice this before, so I'm probably going to stuff it up here a little bit. But you could actually come in and key this frame here, and then you could come over here and actually move the X value out a little bit and key that value there. And that's probably way too slow. So maybe if I bring it out here, yeah, you can now see that the sword is moving out a little bit. Oops, I'll click on this one. Maybe this one we actually started like minus, oh, I don't know, maybe minus 10 even. Hopefully it doesn't show out behind. Yeah, so now the sword is actually looking like it's being pushed. Oh, okay, but it's actually going the opposite way when I flip around. which is not ideal. But you can play around with that. But hopefully you get the idea of how powerful the animation player is. Okay, so I just had a quick look and I realized the reason why it was not working going the opposite direction was I was changing the sword, but I should have been changing the sprite here. So if I come down here to the sprite position, and let's say we key it in at say 40 on the x-axis here at the start of the animation, and then by 0.1 we want that to be 50, and then I really hope this works. Yep, and as you can see, it's pushing out and creating a little bit of animation. So you can play around with the animation player. It is very, very powerful. Good luck with that, and happy coding.